If you're doing anything with hardware, you're going to want a multimeter. But before If you're doing anything with hardware, you're going to want a multimeter. But before you start poking around with power, make sure you know what you're doing. You don't want to run into any problems where you have electrocuted yourself accidentally. So be sure that you've trained and know exactly how to use these multimeters in your environment. These multimeters do so much for us. They can measure voltage and current and resistance. You'll sometimes see them referred to as a VOM, that stands for a volt-ohm meter. There are analog versions, there's digital versions, and all of them are pretty inexpensive. The accuracy will vary widely though. There are some multimeters you can buy for thousands of dollars, or you can buy one for less than $10. You just want to make sure that you have the right kind of multimeter for what you're trying to do. Whenever I'm looking at a multimeter, I want one that is very clear, relatively easy for me to use. I'm not looking for a huge amount of accuracy, and I think my multimeter, which is shown here, probably cost me about $20. And that's about right for the type of work that I do with my computers and the type of things that I need from a multimeter. Multimeters are great for checking things like AC voltage. That alternating current that's coming right out of your connection in the wall can tell us what type of voltages we happen to be seeing. So we can validate that we're getting exactly the right kind of power for the power supply that's inside of our computer. Once our power supply is converting things to direct current, we can check those voltages as well with our multimeter. Check the motherboard. Check to see if your CMOS battery has enough charge inside of it to maintain the configuration of your computer. All that can be done by checking the DC voltage. Continuity checks can be useful as well. You can check fuses. You can check to be sure that cables are connected from one end to the other. Multimeters usually have also a beeping sound you can turn on. So not only are you seeing visual feedback on the multimeter display, you can listen, and when you hear the beeping noise, then you have continuity from one side of the circuit to the other. The newest power supply testers are really easy to use. Most of them have this nice display on the front where I can plug in the power directly from my power supply, and then I can plug in other components into that same power supply as well, and it will give me statistics about voltages and information about what I happen to have plugged in and how much voltage it happens to be using. This is so easy to use. I don't have to stumble around with probes on a multimeter on all of the different connections. I simply plug in all of my components, and this will tell me everything. If you're working at all with network connections or serial connections or wide area network connections, then you might also want to have some loopback plugs available. These loopback plugs are used for testing physical ports, and they're usually used in conjunction with a piece of software that will send information out the port and see if it is receiving information back in the receive side. You'll see these for serial ports, the RS-232, both the 9 and some of the older 25-pin connections. For network connections, you'll see loopback plugs for Ethernet or T1 or fiber type connections. Keep in mind that these are not crossover cables like you might see on the Ethernet side of things. These are very specifically built loopback cables that take everything coming out a transmit connection and send them back through the receive connection on that same device. They look often like this. Very simple. You have traffic coming in, you have traffic you're sending right back out again. And you usually don't need them unless there's a problem. So it's useful to keep them somewhere close to the hardware that you're going to be using them with. You might want to have different loopback ports or loopback cables for different types of media. You may need some for fiber, you may need some for copper, and you're going to need exactly the right interface type for that loopback. Just because it fits into an RJ45 doesn't mean it's for Ethernet. It might be for T1. So make sure you know exactly what they're used for. And if you'd like to make your own, you can absolutely do that. Here's a great website, spacehopper.org/5-N-1, where you can make an Ethernet cable, a crossover cable, a modem, a null modem, and a Cisco console cable, all from one series of adapters. If we're starting up our computer and we're getting nothing from the startup, we may want to use one of these power on self test cards that will look at the power and give us some detailed error messages so that we can find out a little bit more about what might be going wrong with our hardware. When our hardware stops working, nobody's happy. So in this video, I'm going to take you through some common hardware problems and how you might be able to resolve them. One of the most frustrating hardware problems is when the system locks up with no messages whatsoever. Everything stops on the screen. It's as if it suddenly is frozen in time. You can look into the event log, but usually with hardware problems like this and the system stopping completely, there's usually nothing written into that event viewer. Just because the screen is frozen doesn't necessarily mean that the operating system has stopped completely. So check to see if you can see any flashing lights from hard drive access. You may want to hit your numlock key and see if those status lights change. Or try pressing Ctrl-Alt-Delete and try to get control back of the operating system and see if it recovers enough to put information onto the screen. Sometimes problems like this will occur after we've made some type of change to the system. Maybe we've added a new hardware driver. Maybe we installed an operating system patch. You may want to consider all of those things that might have occurred now that this problem is happening. And you may be able to back your system up or recover to a previous date and time and see if the problem is still occurring. Ultimately, if that restore point doesn't resolve things, then we may also want to perform a hardware diagnostics. You want to be sure that anything that might be interrupting the system has been checked and checked very thoroughly. So an overnight test of memory, of your video, and other components may help you find where a problem might be occurring. One very quick hardware test is the one that occurs when you power on your computer. This is called the Power On Self-Test, and it checks a minimal hardware configuration for your PC. Checks to see if your video is there, checks to see if the memory is inside of your computer, checks other components as well. That way it does a basic overview of what might be running inside of your computer. This is not a comprehensive test, but it does give you an idea of if these particular components are working or not. If your video is having a problem, then you're obviously not going to get messages on your screen. In that particular case, your system is going to send beeps through the system speaker, and those beeps will correspond to a particular error message. Every BIOS is a little bit different, so check your manufacturer's documentation and it will tell you exactly what number of beeps is associated with what kind of problem. A blank screen certainly is indicative of a video problem, and maybe the beep messages will help you determine where the problem is occurring, but sometimes the problem is associated with a BIOS configuration, or you may be able to modify the BIOS, and instead of using a separate video card that you've installed, you can now tell the BIOS to use the built-in video and work around some of the problems that might be occurring. Sometimes you'll notice that your computer tries to boot from the wrong device. Maybe you're using an external USB drive, and when you start your system up, it tries to boot from that external drive rather than booting from the internal drive inside of the computer. If you look at the BIOS, you can set what particular drive starts up first, and you can change the order in which these will start. You need to look at the BIOS configuration, and you can modify those so that it's going to start in the way that you would like for your system. If you start up your computer and you notice that it is looping through the startup process, it looks like it's going to start and then it restarts the computer again, then you've got some big problems. So one of the things that you can do is to try to determine where the problem is occurring. Is it occurring during the BIOS check where it's doing the power on self-test, or is it starting to load the Windows operating system and we start to get a splash screen with the Windows logo and then everything starts over again? By making that determination, you may then be able to decide if the problem is related to your hardware or perhaps it's related to your Windows configuration. If you're getting a splash screen and Windows is trying to start up, maybe we can revert our Windows configuration back to a previous date and time, or maybe we have a backup nearby that we can then replace onto this system and get everything running again. If we power off and we unplug our computer and then we plug it back in and power on, it still knows about the configuration of your computer. And it knows this because on your motherboard somewhere is a battery, and that battery is maintaining that BIOS configuration. If the battery goes bad or if the battery no longer has a charge, then obviously the configuration of your computer is going to be erased every time you lose power to that PC. And it may give you prompts saying that the configuration is invalid or that the date and time is not correct. And if that occurs, you may be looking at replacing that particular battery to resolve the problem. If you're having problems with the change that you've made to your BIOS and you can't get into the BIOS and reset that, you may want to clear out all of the configurations by removing the battery. There are also sometimes a jumper on the motherboard that you have to set, so make sure you look at your manufacturer's documentation to determine the best way to clear out that BIOS configuration. Our computers give off a significant amount of heat. There's so many different components inside of our computers that are heating up the system. Things like the CPUs that we're using, our video cards, we have memory that gets hot, and all of these have to be cooled. One of the best ways to cool down our system then is with some cool air that we bring through our computer using fans. We'll usually have the fans pass over the warm equipment, or perhaps there are heat sinks on top of those devices that are taking all of the heat and moving it up so that the air can pass through and cool it that much faster. If you're trying to determine just how hot a computer might be, you can use some software that can examine the sensors that are inside of your computer. One that I use is called HW Monitor. You can find it at cpuid.com, and it brings up information on the screen that gives you an idea of just how hot your computer's getting. That way you can do some troubleshooting. Perhaps take some settings and then clean out your system. Make sure the fans are spinning properly, clear out any dust, turn the system back on, and see if it's having the same problem with the heat. That way you can start to determine where your problems might be occurring as it relates to heat inside of your computer case. One thing your computer should not be doing is making a lot of noise inside of the case. Most of our components are solid state, and the ones that aren't are making a very simple hum, perhaps some fans that are moving, or a hard drive. If we are moving a computer from one place to the other and we notice that something may be jostling around inside of it, we hear some rattling, then some of the components that are inside of that case may be loose. We may want to take off the cover, make sure everything is seated properly, make sure a heat sink hasn't fallen off and is rattling around inside of the computer. We don't want anything that's inside of our computer to also short other components, so make sure you remove anything that might be rattling or moving around inside of the case. If you're hearing scraping, well, that may be a much more significant problem. Occasionally when hard drives begin going bad, you'll start to hear some very odd noises, some scrapes and some clicks coming from those devices, and that may be your warning sign to do a backup as soon as possible. Sometimes clicking noises are relating to fans that might be going bad. They're spinning very quickly inside of your case and they do go bad. So you want to make sure that the clicking noises or any problems that are in there relating to the fans are resolved so the inside of your computer stays as cool as possible. It's said that the smoke inside of your computer is really what's keeping everything running, and if you let the smoke out, then nothing's going to work properly. Obviously, we don't like to see smoke on our computers, and if we smell smoke or smell a bad odor coming from our computer, then it's probably some type of electrical problem. Whenever you run into that kind of problem, you want to disconnect the power as quickly as possible. Remember that our motherboards are still getting power even after we've turned off the computer. The only way to make sure nothing is powered up is to remove the power cord from the back of your computer. After smelling smoke or bad odor, we may want to open up our system and do a visual check. Make sure that you don't see any capacitors that might have blown. Look for something that is a little black on the motherboard, where something doesn't look quite right. Once you've done a full visual inspection, it may be time to do a hardware diagnostics to determine where that particular smell might be coming from. And you certainly want to check out every component inside of that to make sure there's not going to be any problems in the future. Some components on the inside of your computer will have status lights associated with them. We see this all the time with network connections. There may be a light there that shows status or power. Maybe it's an adapter card that's inside of your computer that has these lights on side of it that are going to tell us about how that particular component is working. You can use those status lights to help determine if a component is working or not. If the device goes bad and you notice the status lights are giving an error message or they're not coming on at all, that may point to some bad hardware in that computer. If you're turning on your computer and nothing happens, then you can probably bet that there's some type of power-related issue on your system. So you may want to get out your multimeter, check to make sure you're getting power from the wall outlet, make sure that power is getting through the power supply and onto the motherboard of your system, and maybe then you can help determine where the problem might be occurring when you start your computer. A more frustrating kind of problem is when your system's running fine and then intermittently you have a problem. It's not when you perform a particular function, it's seemingly random whenever it occurs. That certainly points to some type of hardware issue, so perhaps this would be a good time to perform an overnight or more comprehensive hardware check. You also might want to check software drivers. A badly written software driver can cause problems as well, so make sure that there haven't been any changes or make sure that you're running the latest version of your software drivers. If you power up your computer and the fans are spinning, but nothing else is happening, then something is going on with the power that's going to your motherboard. Maybe the power supply is providing enough power for the fans, but not enough power for your motherboard to get going. Or perhaps the motherboard is having a problem because the fan power is coming directly off of the power supply. It's not relying on the motherboard. So your fans are working fine, but perhaps your motherboard is having a problem. That may be a good time to swap out the motherboard and see if the problem is resolved. One thing we hate to see is this blue screen, the Windows stop error, or what we call the blue screen of death. That BSOD is one that really stops everything in its tracks. This is where Windows stops completely and it requires a reboot to get things running again. There's some information on this screen that can be very important, and most of this information is written into a log. So you should be able to go back to your event viewer to determine what happened in the past. Sometimes we're not there when a blue screen occurs, so we can go back to our event viewer and see exactly what has occurred and what those error messages might have been. Once we have those details, we may be able to track down exactly where the problem's occurring. This blue screen might be able to point us, for instance, to a particular file that we can then check to see if we have a newer version, an updated device driver. Maybe the information that's provided in the error is going to tell us more about what's going on. And then the information at the bottom, although it's a lot of details and hexadecimal information, we may be able to provide that to the technical support team for the manufacturer, and they may be able to resolve what's going on with your hardware. The hard drives that we have inside of our computers are spinning mechanical devices, and they are prone to failure. So it's important to know what we can do when we run into problems with our hard drive components. If you're using your computer and you get a message on your screen saying that there's some type of failure when reading and writing, you might get a message like this one that says, "Cannot read from the source disk." Well, that certainly points to some type of problem with the storage device on that computer. Sometimes you don't even get an error message. You'll just get a blue screen of death, and it's pointing to some type of problem with corrupted files. Maybe there are read-write failures, and the whole reason we're having these issues is because the hardware itself on the storage device is having a problem. One thing you can do to check the hard drive is to run a check disk, and there's an option inside of check disk to check every single sector on a surface analysis. That way you can be sure that it is reading and writing to every single part of that disk successfully. If you're noticing that things are slowing down, especially when you're trying to read a file or write a file, make sure you check the LED lights that flash whenever there's disk activity. If you notice they're flashing over and over and over again as it's trying to retry that disk, then you might be having a problem with that hardware. Maybe a good time to back up. And of course, if anything sounds odd, especially as it's trying to read that disk and you hear the drive resetting itself and making clicking noise, that certainly speaks to a hard drive problem. You should immediately back up your data, and you need to look at replacing that drive as soon as possible. One problem you don't want to run into is when you start up your computer and you see a message that says the drive is not recognized. You need to look very closely at status lights, examine the messages that are on your screen to help determine more about where the problem might be occurring. Sometimes I will plug in an external USB drive to my laptop. I'll forget I have it there. I'll power down my system and power it back on, and my computer is configured to try to boot from that USB. And I receive a message that says the system can't find an operating system. And suddenly I'm very concerned, but then I realize, of course, that I have the USB drive plugged in and I can unplug it and restart my system and it starts normally. I could get around this problem by changing the boot sequence in my BIOS and tell it not to check for any USB drives to boot from, to go automatically to the internal hard drive inside of my laptop, and don't check anything that might be plugged in externally. You can also disable the interface completely if that's a concern. That way you can be assured that nothing will look at at that interface when it goes through the boot up process. If we haven't changed anything, we haven't plugged in any external devices, then the problem may just be something physical inside of our computer. So it may be worthwhile opening it up and making sure that all of those connections are tight. Our systems get hot and they cool down, and occasionally we'll have a cable problem inside of our computer. So make sure it's not something simple that you can easily resolve by tightening down all of those connections. And if this is a new storage device, we want to be sure that our configurations are set exactly the way they should be. So if this is a PATA drive, you may want to look at the jumpers on the drive and make sure that we have everything plugged into the right interface. And if it's SCSI connectors, we want to be sure that all of our SCSI IDs are configured properly and the terminator is at the end of that SCSI chain. If we start up our computer, it goes to our storage device to try to boot, and we see a message that says the operating system is not found. Well, that speaks to more of a file system problem. And a common workaround is to rebuild the master boot record and perhaps also rebuild the boot sector on that drive. In Windows XP, we would do this from the recovery console. We can use fix MBR to overwrite the master boot record and do a fix boot C: to update the boot sector that's on their drive. If you're running Windows Vista or Windows 7, we do this from the command prompt and we use the boot rec command with a /fix MBR or a /fix boot to fix either the master boot record or the boot sector. If you'd like to see exactly how this is done, I do an entire hands-on session in my video called Using the Windows Recovery Console and Command Prompt. It is from my 220.801 videos, section 1.3. A lot of our server devices these days are using redundant arrays of independent disks or RAID arrays. And if we have problems with the controller itself and we start up our computer, we might see problems like the RAID is not found. So you may want to check the RAID configuration on your computer and make sure the controller itself is working properly. If it's missing or it's faulty, we may see messages inside of our computer during the startup that will give us messages that say this is not configured and not working properly. If we start up our computer and we get a message that the array itself is having a problem, then we may want to launch the RAID console that's on your computer to see what the status is for the drives. The different RAID manufacturers have different ways of doing this. So you want to check your documentation to see which one works for you so that you can tell if drives are available in the RAID, if any happen to be missing, and you want to be able to correlate back the numbers of the drives with the physical drive inside of your computer. You don't want to replace the wrong drive inside of your array. So make sure you double check and that you're replacing exactly the right drives. If your operating system is running slow, you may want to make sure that you've got the latest version of everything. So try running Windows Update. Make sure you have the latest security patches and operating system patches. This might also allow you to update some additional drivers, all by using Windows Update. Windows can also begin to run very slowly if it's running out of disk space. So you may want to check and make sure that you have plenty of available disk space. And if you're accessing a lot of files, you may want to run a defrag just to make sure that your inefficiencies aren't caused by files that may be scattered on different places on the drive. If you're running a laptop, one of the configuration options you have is to always run the CPU at a slower speed if it doesn't have power. That allows you to have a much longer battery time, but it also means that your system's going to run slower. So check your BIOS configuration for those slowdown options and make sure that you're not missing any CPU cycles just because you happen to be running away from AC power. If you look at your task manager, you should be able to see all of your applications and you can see exactly how many resources each app is using. So look through your list in Task Manager and look to see if any particular app is using a lot of CPU utilization. You also might want to look at some of the input-output statistics. Some of the slowdowns may be because you're reading or writing to your hard drive. And of course, sometimes slowdowns are caused by malicious software. So you may want to run a scan in your antivirus or your anti-malware application to see if someone might have slipped something really bad onto your machine that's slowing everything down for you. If your operating system isn't even starting, then we've got other places that we should look for problems. One is the device manager and the event viewer to see if anything might not be loading properly during startup, or maybe you can find an error message or more details about a problem that's all saved in your event viewer. Sometimes just a bad driver can cause a problem for your entire Windows desktop. So finding that one specific problem will get you halfway to solving the overall issue. Sometimes when you're starting your system, you'll see a message pop up that says one or more services failed to start. Sometimes you know exactly what it might be referring to, but more often than not, we're not really sure what problem we're having with a Windows service. So we want to gather more information. You might want to go to your Windows services and begin starting services manually to see if you can get any of them to fail. Then at least you know which ones are causing a problem for you. Make sure that your account permissions are set properly in the service so that they are starting properly with a service account or with an account that has the rights to do what it needs to do. Look at any dependencies for that service. Maybe it's not starting because another service has to start first. So as long as you start them in order, they'll work properly, but make sure there's no dependencies that you're waiting on. If it's a Windows service, then you'll want to check the system files that actually run that service. And it may require that you install the application again that manages that service so that it rebuilds and reconfigures everything for that service to start properly. Microsoft Windows has a capability called a dynamic link library. This is some software that's in your Windows operating system that can be used by many applications, even third-party applications. These applications, instead of writing this code that would be commonly used and redundant across all of the applications, they can all simply write to this central dynamic link library to perform the functions that they need. Makes it much more efficient to do development work and also makes things more efficient for the operating system. The challenge you have is that these DLLs have different versions. They might all have the same name, but there might be minor differences between them. And applications are usually written to use a very specific version of a DLL. In older versions of Windows, you would have a lot of problems trying to manage these version numbers. You'd overwrite the DLL with a newer version, and some of your older applications would not work properly with it. And so in the latest version of Windows, there's a couple of different technologies, one called Windows File Protection and Windows Resource Protection, and they're in place to make sure that your system DLLs and your third-party DLLs are not going to have any conflicts. You can have all of those dynamic link libraries on your system simultaneously, and your application will use the correct DLL for that app to work properly. You've probably seen in your data files that you're storing that they all have some very unique extensions. You might save a Word document and it has a docx extension. You might save a PowerPoint presentation and it has a pptx extension. It's this extension that tells Windows what application should run to be able to use that particular data file. This list of applications is all inside of Windows, and they can also be modified. Sometimes they can be modified by third-party applications. So one day you're using PowerPoint to do your presentations, you load some new software, and now suddenly the PowerPoint presentations don't start automatically when you click on that particular pptx file. So you might want to go into your Windows File Associations and Windows XP. In your folder options, you can look at the File Types tab, and in Windows Vista and Windows 7, you can go into your Control Panel and look at the default Programs applet. If you've upgraded your operating system and you notice that some of your old applications aren't working properly, you might want to try changing the compatibility for those applications. This is a nice capability built into Windows that allows it this backwards compatibility. If you want to look at the application properties, it will bring up this dialog box, and under the compatibility tab, you can decide to run this program in compatibility mode 4, and you can choose the operating system that would apply for this particular application. Sometimes those older apps that haven't been updated to a new version of Windows can still run just by using this compatibility mode. If your computer isn't starting at all, there's a number of troubleshooting steps we can pass through. If you're getting a message that there is an invalid boot disk, you might want to see if there's any USB devices plugged in. Your BIOS might be configured to try to boot from those devices instead of booting from the local hard drive. You can also go into the BIOS configuration itself and modify what devices should start first for your computer. You might also see a message that pops up that says, operating system not found. That's usually when you are accessing a drive that's a boot device, but there's no bootloader anywhere on that computer. You might have to go into the recovery console or the Windows recovery environment and run a check disk to see if your operating system is indeed on that computer system, or maybe the drive is simply pointing to the wrong place for the operating system. Maybe you just need to update the master boot record, and then your system would be able to find the operating system properly. On older versions of Windows, like Windows XP, you might see a message that says your NT loader is missing, NT LDR. These are very important system boot files, and if for some reason they are deleted from your computer, then obviously nothing is going to start. You would commonly start your computer with a boot disk that allows you to copy those files back to the hard drive, restart your system, and your Windows should be up and running. An important system file that gets things running on your computer on Windows XP is the boot.ini file. On newer versions of Windows, Windows Vista and Windows 7, you have the bootcfg boot configuration database. If you are having problems with your boot ini, you can manually edit that in a text editor, but Windows Vista and Windows 7 have this special database format. It's no longer a text file. So if you need to rebuild that, you would choose from the recovery console bootcfg/rebuild, and it will rebuild that boot configuration database so that then you can choose the operating system that needs to load when you start your computer. If your computer did not shut down properly and you've restarted your computer, you may notice that it does not go directly into Windows. It may run a Windows error recovery window that then runs an auto check of the drive and the file system. That way it makes sure that everything is still exactly where it should be so that it knows it can start Windows without running into any problems. And if Windows does start up and we see nothing, we see a black screen, there's no user interface, there's no login screen, then we probably have a problem with the device driver that's running the video for our system. We may want to update that video driver by starting in safe mode. You might also want to start in the graphics mode for VGA graphics or lower resolution graphics with Windows so that you can at least get the screen to a point where you can load up the new drivers. You might also be able to recover from a previous version of Windows or from your backups. There's also a repair mode in Windows Vista and Windows 7 that might help, and these might get you past some of these video glitches so that you can get back to the Windows desktop. A message that every Windows user hates to see is that blue screen of death, that Windows stop error. And that's usually pointing towards bad hardware or a device driver that's somehow gone bad. You may be able to use the last known good configuration, the system restore functionality, or simply roll back a driver to a previous version if you just updated one and started seeing this mode. One way to get around this problem is to perhaps use the last known good configuration. You can also go back to a previous point in time using the system restore functionality. And if you've just installed a new driver and now you're starting to see this blue screen of death, you might want to use the Windows rollback driver functionality to go back to the previous version. You may have to start in safe mode so that you can get through these driver problems to be able to run things like the rollback driver functionality. If this is a piece of hardware that is seated inside of your computer and you think that's what's causing the problem, you might want to pull it out and reseat it to make sure it's got a very good connection. Obviously, not all hardware is going to apply here, but if this is something new that you've added into the inside of your computer, it's worth making sure that it's got a good connection on the motherboard. And lastly, if you're just not sure where the problem is coming from, you might want to run a hardware diagnostics. Make sure that your hard drive is working normally, that the memory is performing as it should, so that these blue screen messages can be cleared up once and for all.